Hello everyone, and welcome to week 2 of English 121. You guys have all done a great job so far of logging in, of getting orientated into our Blackboard environment, of logging on to the Pearson site, the interactive part of our literature textbook. And I've really enjoyed getting to know so many of you in the introduction conversation. So let's get started with week 2. What you need to complete this week. You'll need to watch this lecture about plot, and I suggest you download the slides. That'll give you details on all the things I'm going to be talking about that you can go back to. You're going to need to actively read Chapter 1, the rest of Chapter 1 in our literature textbook, found on pages 14 through 25. You're also going to need to actively listen to or read along to The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. There's a link to the New Yorker fiction podcast, a recording of someone reading this aloud under course content. But there's also a print version of the short story in our textbook found on pages 262 to 268. You also want to read Shirley Jackson, the author of The Lottery, on writing, which is found on page 269 of our textbook. Next, you're going to participate in a conversation where we're going to be close reading the short story The Lottery for plot and using the new tools you guys are going to have to do so. And then week 2, your reflection journal will be about A&P. There's some critical questions that I'd like you to think about and answer in your response. So by the end of the week, the main goal here is that you should feel comfortable both identifying and critically analyzing the elements of plot in a short story. To start off, I just want to give a congratulations to Dominic, your class member. Correctly identified the 3 people who were pictured in the introductory slides last week. For fiction, representing fiction, we have Flannery O'Connor, who wrote some amazing short stories. For poetry, you have one of my favorite poets, Amy Lowell. And for drama, you have the amazing August Wilson. So what we're going to be doing in this class, what I briefly talked about last week, and what I'll continue to talk about for the next few weeks, is you're going to be actively reading texts. This checklist that you see here is something you should print out and keep with you for every time you read a text. For this week, I'm going to help you go through the checklist and really actively read the readings so you're prepared to critically think about them and do the assignments for this week. But if at any time you're feeling like you don't understand active reading, like you have extra questions about it, I urge you to stop by my office hours or to call me during my office hours so that we can further discuss it. So let's start with talking about plot. Plot refers to the events that occur in a story and how those events are arranged in the story by the author. In a story, usually there's a dramatic situation that's created when a character experiences a conflict of some kind. How the parts of the story are arranged, how this conflict happens, and when it's revealed to the readers, that's part of the artistry of being an author. There's some tricks to plot that people use. You've probably seen a lot of action movies will start in medias res, which means in the middle of things. So starting with this, this big action that happens, and then working back to how it happened. Flashbacks. While you're telling a story, maybe you want to tell the backstory about something, and you use a flashback to an earlier time. Or foreshadowing. Something you'll see in The Lottery is foreshadowing, is hints at what's going to happen later in the text, kind of laid out like clues in the beginning. There's terminology we use to talk about the parts of a story. So the exposition is the opening portion of a story. And this is where you really set the scene and you introduce the main characters and you give any background information that the audience needs to know so that we can really understand the story. Usually within the exposition, you meet the protagonist, and the protagonist is the main character in a story. Um, then, what happens next is usually the crisis. This is a moment of high tension. And then, as that crisis rises, it reaches a climax. And that's the moment of the greatest moment of tension in the whole story. The conclusion is when that conflict is resolved in some way, and it's also called resolution or denouement, and that is really the ending of the story, how it all um, ties in a knot and comes together in the end. Now, not all stories will have all of these parts, but most stories do. Now, when you write about plot, there's a lot of questions you should ask, and this is a checklist for you to print out and keep with you when you're writing about plot. And when we have exams, you will be able to use these printouts, so they're a good thing to have. Um, the first thing you want to think about is, what is the story's central conflict? What's the big problem that's happening in the story? Who is the protagonist? Who is the main character? And what is it that he or she really wants? And what's at stake for this protagonist in the conflict? What stands in the way of the protagonist easily achieving his or her goals? What are the main events that take place in this story? How does each event relate to the protagonist's struggle? Where do you find the story's climax or crisis? Where's the big event that happens? How is the conflict resolved? And does the protagonist succeed in achieving his or her goals? What is the impact of the protagonist's success or their failure or the surprising outcome that occurs? What is the impact of that on the protagonist? All right, well, let's use this information to think about the short story A and P by John Updike. You'll find this text directly in the literature textbook directly after the information about plot. Now, before you read anything in this class, you want to ask a few questions. The first thing you're going to ask is, who is the author? So you're going to think about, who is John Updike? Do you know anything about him? The first thing you do is really ask yourself, do you know anything about him? Then I want you to read the biography that's in our textbook. That is required reading. Don't just skim over it. You really want to know who it is who's writing the story or poem or drama that you're going to be reading. And then if you're still curious about the author, you can go ahead and Google the author. And later in the semester, I'll show you how to get even more in depth in finding out information about who the author is, what they've written, what they've done as an author. Next, I want you to think about what genre the text is. Genre is the type of literature you're working with. In the case of the early part of the semester, the answer to this question will always be fiction, and the subgenre of fiction is short story. So in the case of A&P, it's a short story. When it was written, it's pretty easy for you to decipher in this text. At the top of each of the texts in our textbook, there's a date written on the right-hand side. You want to make sure you look at that before you begin reading. This particular text was it was published in 1961. You really want to think about, how have things changed since 1961? You're going to be reading about a scene involving teenagers. You want to think about, how do teenagers act the same as they did in 1961 as they do now? That'll help you think about it as you're reading the text. What's the title of the text? And based on this title, what do you predict this text will be about? So in the case of A and P, do you know what A and P stands for? If you Google it, you'll see pretty quickly that it's the title of a chain of grocery stores. And that's important because this story really relies on that as being a huge part of what the story is about. Then, the next thing I want you to do, after you've thought about this text, you've answered these questions, is to take out a pen or pencil, look at the page, and start answering the questions that you see to the right. This is what you're going to be doing during the reading. Again, if you are using a rented textbook, you're going to need to find a way, like sticky notes or something, that you can stick in there so you can write your notes along the text. You're going to need to show me evidence of this in the next few weeks when we have conferences. So to get all your points, you're going to need to be able to show me your active reading notes. So while you're reading, you want to circle any words that aren't familiar to you, and you want to look them up. That way, you'll have the definition right there. You want to mark words or passages that make you think about things that you've already read or you've had, or personal experiences you've had. Maybe you've had a similar experience in a supermarket as the experience that the girls in A&P have. Mark passages that you agree with or disagree with, and state why you agree or disagree with the passage. Sometimes when people are reading A&P, they get really annoyed with how the narrator, the protagonist of the story, talks about the young girls in the story. So if that bothers you, you want to say, I disagree with this part, and tell us why. You want to mark passages you like, and tell us why you like those passages. You want to mark parts of the text that highlight the main theme. What do you think the main point of the story is? Why did John Updike write it? What is he communicating? And try to, at the end, try to summarize what happens in the story. Finally, while you're reading, you want to ask questions. Like ask the narrator questions. Why are you doing this? Why are you looking at them that way? Why are you thinking this? What are you thinking? Ask Updike questions. Say, I can't believe you're doing this, or I think this is really awesome. Talk back to him. And you can ask characters, or you can ask yourself questions. Why am I so pissed off by this story? Or what is it about this story that I can't stop reading it? Finally, if you see any literary elements, such as metaphor, simile, symbol, I want you to try to identify them. This is not required at this point because we haven't learned them all, but it's something you should be thinking about. All right, after you read A&P, I want you to click on, in the e-text, I want you to click at the end, there's a link to watch the video. It's on page 14 of the e-text. I want you to click on that link and watch the sections reading and interpreting. They're short videos that talk in more detail about the text. All right, to prepare you for actively reading the lottery, the second short story we're going to be reading this week, I want you to do the same process that you've done with A&P. First, before you read or listen to the text, you want to think about who was Shirley Jackson. Remember, you can look at the biography on page 72 of the e-text or on pages 262 to 263 of the print text. And then ask yourself, do you know anything about her already? Is this the first time you've seen her name? What did you learn by reading the biography? Then I want you to answer the very easy question this week. What genre is the text? We know we're talking about fiction, and we know this is a short story. When it was written, this is important in the case of this text. This story was published in 1948. Remember to look at the top of the page where the story is printed, right below the title, and it'll tell you when it was published. It's important because what had just happened in 1948 in America? It's really important to think about what events had just occurred. Where was it published? We learned from reading the bio that this short story was first published in the New Yorker, which is a leading literary magazine at the time. What does the title of the text make you think about? What does it make you think this text is going to be about? What are the words the lottery make you think this is going to be about? All right, so while you listen, I want you to go through the same questions you went through for the last text. Circle words that you don't know. Go through this entire list, okay? After you've done that, you're going to complete the 2 assignments for this week. The first assignment is on the lottery. I want you to join the conversation, and we're going to be thinking about how to talk about plot in a story. So you're going to be using those questions I told you about, the questions you want to ask yourself about plot, as a way to think about the short story. So the first question you're going to answer is, what is the main conflict of the story? Then you're going to tell me, who is the protagonist? What does he or she want? What is at stake for the protagonist in the conflict? What stands in the way of the protagonist easily achieving his or her goals? What are the main events that take place in the story? How does each event relate to the protagonist's struggle? Where do you find the story's climax or crisis, and how is the conflict resolved? Does the protagonist succeed in achieving his or her goals? And what is the impact of success, failure, or a surprising outcome on the protagonist? I think in this story, that's a really important question to answer. Finally, I want you to read Writing Effectively, Shirley Jackson on Writing. In this short essay, Shirley Jackson talks about the reception of this story, which was one of the New Yorker's most reacted to stories that they've ever published. They received hundreds and hundreds of letters about it. Um, it really caused a sensation. And I want you to think about, why do you think readers reacted so intensely to this story? How did you feel when you read or listened to the story? Can you understand why readers of the New Yorker felt so strongly about it? So clearly state your answers to those questions in our conversation. Once you post your own post, which will be due by Saturday at 11:59 p.m., you need to respond to at least 3 of your peers' posts by the following Tuesday. All right, the next thing I want you to do is to write about A&P, John Updike's short story, in your reflection journal. I have a series of questions written here that I want you to think about and use examples from the text to really support your answers. We're practicing using thinking critically about a text and the plot in a text. All right, guys, that's it for this week. If you have next week we're going to be talking about point of view, and we're going to be reading 2 short stories, A Rose for Emily and Sunny's Blues. And we'll have a conversation, and you'll be writing in your reflection journal. Please make sure you stop by my office if you have any questions. My office hours are posted in our course. They're also posted on our course syllabus. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I look forward to seeing you online.